When Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, they brought with them more than men and tanks. They brought a promise. The promise of liberation, of ending the war in Europe before the year was out. Operation Overlord had been the most daring amphibious assault in history, and once the beachhead was secure, the Allies poured in everything they had. Nearly 2 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and millions of tons of supplies. But the success of D-Day carried a hidden danger. The faster the Allied armies broke out of Normandy, the more their supply lines would stretch thin. And in the late summer of 1944, that danger became a full-blown crisis. After the brutal hedgerow fighting of June and July, the front finally cracked open with Operation Cobra. American forces burst through the German defenses at St. Lo, and Patton's newly formed Third Army swept into the open countryside with a ferocity few could have imagined. His tanks didn't just advance while they sprinted. Every hour gained was a victory. Every village liberated a step closer to Germany itself. Yet every mile east meant another mile farther from the beaches, the lifeline through which every bullet, ration and drop of fuel had to pass. Normandy's ports had been heavily damaged. The Allies relied on makeshift mulberry harbors, massive floating docks that allowed ships to unload supplies onto the beaches. It was an engineering marvel, but not built for this kind of speed. The roads behind the front were clogged with traffic. Railways were wrecked by bombing. Bridges lay in ruins. The further Patton moved, the thinner the supply chain stretched. The Allied planners had anticipated a slower pace. They never imagined the German army in France would collapse this quickly. Within weeks, entire Wehrmacht divisions were retreating eastward. In their wake, towns were abandoned, infrastructure destroyed. For every success on the battlefield, the logistical burden grew heavier. By early August, the U.S. Army was facing a paradox. Its most aggressive commander was on the verge of a decisive breakthrough, but his fuel tanks were nearly empty. Each Sherman tank in Patton's army drank about a gallon of fuel every 2 miles. Each armored division required hundreds of thousands of gallons every day. Ammunition, spare parts, food, and medical supplies followed in endless columns. Without constant resupply, even the most powerful army in the world would become little more than stranded steel. At Allied headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower watched the situation with both pride and alarm. The advance was exceeding every expectation, but it was unsustainable. Logistics officers warned that the lines from Normandy to the front were now over 400 miles long. What once could be delivered by ship and short truck runs now required thousands of vehicles operating around the clock. Still, Eisenhower and Patton both knew momentum was everything. The Germans were reeling, disorganized, demoralized. If they were allowed time to regroup behind the Seine or at the Siegfried Line, the war could drag on for months, maybe years. Patton pressed his advantage relentlessly. His famous words captured his mindset. A good plan, violently executed now, is better than a perfect plan next week. But his tanks didn't run on courage or speed. They ran on gasoline, and by mid-August, gasoline was the scarcest weapon in France. Across Allied headquarters, logisticians scrambled for answers. They experimented with rail repairs, convoys, and airlifts, but nothing worked fast enough. Then, a radical idea began to take shape. A non-stop convoy route that would bypass all bureaucracy and deliver fuel directly from Normandy to the front. It was a plan born out of desperation, and it would soon test the endurance of men and machines to their absolute limits. The clock was ticking. Patton's tanks were closing in on Paris, but his fuel gauges were nearing zero. By the second week of August 1944, the Allied command faced an invisible enemy: distance. The war map showed victory racing eastward, but on the ground, victory was devouring its own lifeline. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every can of food had to travel farther each day over roads never meant to bear such weight. In Cherbourg, supplies stacked up by the hundreds of thousands of tons. In the fields beyond Le Mans, soldiers sat idle beside silent tanks, watching their last drops of gasoline evaporate. One officer remarked grimly, "We are winning ourselves to death." The railways were no help. French tracks lay twisted from Allied bombing campaigns. Locomotives were destroyed or captured. The few lines that survived were choked with repair trains or Allied engineers desperately patching bridges. Air transport offered speed but little capacity, not enough to feed an army that consumed tens of thousands of tons daily. At the top of the chain, General Eisenhower understood the stakes. His grand strategy depended on speed and coordination. The British to the north under Montgomery were driving toward Belgium. Patton's Third Army was sweeping southeast toward Lorraine and eventually Germany. Both armies demanded priority for fuel and ammunition, but there was not enough for both. Every decision meant choosing who would move and who would stop. Patton refused to stop. His staff begged, argued, and pleaded for more fuel. The logistics officers at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEF, faced an impossible equation. Then came a proposal so bold it bordered on reckless: create a dedicated, high-speed trucking route, closed to civilian traffic, that would carry supplies directly from the beaches and depots to the front lines, non-stop. It was inspired by American rail freight terminology. On U.S. railroads, Red Ball marked priority express cargo, freight that must move without delay. Now the name would be reborn on the battlefields of Europe. The Red Ball Express was approved almost overnight. Its concept was brutally simple: a one-way loop. Trucks loaded with fuel, ammunition, and rations would travel east on a designated route to the front. They would return empty on a separate westbound road. No stops, no detours, no interference. Roads would be patrolled by military police, and all civilian traffic would be banned. It was a logistical artery, an unbroken stream of trucks that would run day and night, 7 days a week. But execution would be chaos. The Army lacked drivers, mechanics, and vehicles, so they called upon every available transport company in northern France, most of them composed of African American soldiers. At a time when segregation still defined the U.S. military, these men were often assigned to support roles rather than combat. Now they were asked to shoulder one of the most critical operations of the entire European campaign. They responded without hesitation. On August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated, the first convoys of the Red Ball Express roared to life. More than 5,000 trucks rolled out from Saint-Lô toward Chartres and beyond, loaded with gasoline cans, artillery shells, food, and spare parts. Drivers painted a red ball on their windshields and front bumpers, their badge of honor and their pass on the open road. The route stretched nearly 700 kilometers at its peak, winding through the heart of liberated France. Military police manned every junction. Mechanics worked along the roadsides. Convoys were scheduled by the minute, thousands of trucks moving like veins in a living organism. Each driver knew the risks. German fighter planes still roamed the skies. Roads were mined, bridges damaged, and traffic accidents were constant. But if they failed, Patton's tanks would grind to a halt, and with them, the Allied dream of ending the war in 1944. In the coming weeks, the Red Ball Express would become something no one expected, not just a supply operation, but a symbol of endurance, unity, and speed unmatched in modern warfare. As the engines roared into the French night, no one yet knew how far this lifeline could stretch, or how close it would come to breaking. The roads were open, the trucks were rolling, and the race to fuel Patton's blitz had begun. They were mostly young and barely out of high school. Many had never seen Europe before, and most never expected to drive through it under fire. Of the roughly 23,000 men who served on the Red Ball Express, nearly 75% were African American. In an era of deep segregation, they wore U.S. uniforms but ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate tents, and were often told they'd never see glory. But on the open roads of France, none of that mattered. Out there, courage was measured not by color but by endurance. Drivers faced 20-hour shifts with barely enough time to sleep or eat. Convoys rolled day and night, headlights blacked out to avoid German aircraft. They followed white guideposts or the faint glow of the truck ahead. The dust was so thick that many drove by instinct, coughing through scarves wrapped over their mouths. Each man carried not just fuel, but responsibility. To keep Patton's tanks alive, to keep the war moving. The Germans called Allied soldiers mechanized ants, but these men were something more, the lifeblood of the entire front. Their convoys were constant targets for strafing attacks, ambushes, and exhaustion. Drivers joked grimly, "You either drove fast or you died tired." But despite the dangers, the morale stayed high. Many took pride in knowing that when Patton's tanks roared across France, it was their fuel in the engines. One sergeant later recalled, "We didn't carry medals or rifles, but we carried victory on our backs. They were soldiers without glory, heroes without parades, but without them, the Blitz would have burned out before it began." The trucks themselves were nothing special, at least not at first glance. The GMC CCKW-2, 12666, known simply as the Deuce and a Half, became the backbone of the Red Ball Express. Rugged, reliable, and simple to repair, it was the unsung hero of Allied logistics. Each truck could carry roughly 5,000 pounds of cargo, fuel drums, ammunition crates, rations, or replacement parts. Many drivers modified their vehicles in the field, cutting off fenders for easier maintenance, welding makeshift armor, or strapping spare tires to the sides like shields. The roads tore them apart. France's highways were narrow, broken, and littered with wrecks. Mechanics along the route worked non-stop, scavenging parts from disabled trucks to keep the rest running. Tires blew, engines overheated, and brakes failed on mountain descents. Still, the trucks kept rolling. They were built for punishment, a product of American industry that turned factories into war machines. Detroit's assembly lines had given birth to an army of wheels, and now, that army was saving the war. By late August, the Red Ball Express was moving nearly 12,000 tons of supplies every day. The numbers were staggering. More fuel was being burned to deliver gasoline than the entire French rail network could have transported in peacetime. It was inefficient, wasteful, and utterly necessary. For every gallon that reached Patton's tanks, several had been consumed just getting it there. Yet without those roaring engines, the steel tied across France would have turned to rust. In every sense, the Red Ball Express was a mechanical miracle, a battlefield pipeline made of courage, sweat, and diesel fumes. From their command post in Paris, Reims, and later along the German border, the Wehrmacht's generals watched the Allied advance with confusion. Their intelligence reports told them the Americans were moving faster than logistics should allow. To seasoned German officers, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, this was inconceivable. No modern army could sustain an armored advance without rail support. In the Wehrmacht, fuel shortages were constant. Even during their 1940 invasion of France, panzer divisions had to halt repeatedly for resupply. So when the U.S. Third Army continued pushing east through August and September, German analysts concluded it was a bluff, that the Americans would soon run dry. One captured German officer scoffed, "They fight like rich men, throwing fuel and bullets as if from endless wells." What he didn't know was that behind every advancing tank were thousands of overworked truckers driving day and night, risking death to maintain that illusion of limitless strength. German field units, starved for their own supplies, could scarcely imagine such abundance. Their intelligence officers misread the Red Ball's success as proof of Allied overextension, not realizing that the Americans had created a moving supply artery unlike anything the world had seen. By the time they grasped the truth, it was too late. The Americans weren't stopping, and the Red Ball Express was the reason why. As German disbelief hardened into alarm, the Allied lifeline grew only stronger and more dangerous. Its success, however, came with new burdens, leadership strain, moral conflict, and the physical collapse of men who had given everything. At the top of the Allied command, every mile of road was a contest of will. General George S. Patton, bold, impatient, and relentless, demanded results that defied arithmetic. His tanks could only move as fast as the gasoline reached them, yet he refused to slow down. He pushed his staff and quartermasters with the same ferocity he used on the battlefield. To Patton, logistics wasn't background work, it was combat by another name. He called supply officers my lifeline generals, reminding them that an army is like a piece of cooked spaghetti. It can only move as far as it's pushed, but even Patton's determination met limits. His divisions were burning nearly 400,000 gallons of fuel per day, and the Red Ball Express, though running around the clock, could barely keep up. Eisenhower's staff at Schaeff had to allocate precious fuel between Patton's drive east and Montgomery's push north toward Belgium. Every decision risked sparking conflict among the Allies themselves. There were bitter arguments in briefings, quiet frustration in field depots, and growing exhaustion among those who worked the endless roads. Yet somehow the Red Ball delivered. Major General John C.H. Lee, head of the communications zone, took personal control of the operations coordination. His command turned chaos into rhythm. Drivers, mechanics, and dispatchers moved supplies like blood through veins. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, later called it a miracle of movement, and through it all Patton pressed forward, knowing that momentum itself was a weapon, one fed by every gallon hauled on those endless French roads. Behind the thunder of engines and the statistics of tonnage lay a quieter, deeper story, one of dignity under fire. Most of the Red Ball Express drivers were Black American soldiers, serving in segregated units. In the hierarchy of the U.S. Army, they were rarely praised, often overlooked, and almost never promoted beyond non-commissioned ranks. Many were assigned to transportation, construction, and labor, roles seen as secondary to combat. But in the chaos of France, their work became the backbone of victory. They drove through sniper fire, repaired trucks under shelling, and braved exhaustion few could endure. They were often denied entry to the very cafes they helped liberate. Yet they carried the supplies that freed Europe. In letters home, many wrote about the contradiction, to fight for freedom abroad while being denied equality at home. Yet their pride ran deeper than bitterness. "We knew," one driver later recalled, "that if we stopped, Patton stopped. And if Patton stopped, the war stopped." The Red Ball Express became a quiet rebellion against prejudice, proof that valor had no color. White and black soldiers alike shared the same dangers on the road, and many began to see each other not through the lens of segregation, but through mutual respect earned in shared exhaustion. When the war ended, official histories scarcely mentioned them, but among the men who lived it there was no doubt. The Red Ball's heartbeat with African American endurance. Every drop of fuel delivered by the Red Ball Express became a tactical weapon. The route transformed logistics into strategy. By late August, Patton's Third Army had advanced nearly 400 miles from its original position, a feat no one thought possible. German defenses crumbled as his armored columns burst through towns like Chartres, Reims, and Verdun. Their speed was disorienting. What the Wehrmacht called the Ghost Army was, in truth, an army running on a river of gasoline and grit. The Red Ball Express turned supply into firepower. Convoy timetables were matched with offensive planning. Every battalion's fuel reserve determined how far they could attack the next morning. The faster the trucks rolled, the faster the front lines moved. Even enemy intelligence began tracking the convoy routes, realizing too late that cutting the Red Ball meant crippling Patton's punch. But the Americans guarded it fiercely. Engineers repaired bombed bridges overnight. MPs rerouted traffic instantly, and pilots provided limited air cover along key stretches. In essence, the Red Ball Express became a weaponized highway. It blurred the line between logistics and combat. For Patton, every road was a battlefield, and the Red Ball was his secret front. But even weapons can break. The faster the Third Army moved, the more the system strained. Engines overheated, men collapsed, and the roads became a river of smoke and dust. Still, the Express never stopped. Not once. And as it pushed deeper into France, it carried the war to a point of no return, toward its decisive turning point. By early September 1944, that breaking point was near. The trucks were still roaring, but the strain on men, machines, and fuel itself would soon reach its limit. The Red Ball Express had become both a triumph and a ticking time bomb. By the closing days of August 1944, the Red Ball Express had become the beating heart of the Allied advance. From Saint-Lô to Chartres, from Le Mans to Verdun, the roads thundered without pause, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Convoys rolled like living chains of steel, one truck every 60 yards, headlights dimmed to narrow slits, their engines rumbling through a haze of dust and exhaust. This was logistics at war's highest tempo, a mechanical symphony conducted by desperation. Every morning, the same ritual played out. Mechanics checked tires still hot from the night run. Quartermasters shouted orders over the roar of engines. Drivers, eyes red from fatigue, wolfed down cold rations and clambered back into their seats. Some had gone days without proper sleep, steering by instinct, guided by the faint red circles painted on signs along the route. There was no time to rest. Patton's Third Army was devouring fuel faster than the convoys could deliver it. His armored divisions in the 4th, 6th, and 7th were racing eastward, capturing bridges and towns at an unprecedented pace. Within weeks, Patton had crossed the Seine, liberated Chartres, and pushed his tanks nearly to the Moselle River. It was one of the fastest military advances in history, and it all hinged on the trucks roaring behind him. In just 82 days, the Red Ball Express would move nearly 400,000 tons of supplies, fuel, food, and ammunition, enough to keep 1 million men and 20,000 vehicles fighting across a continent. But the cost was staggering. Road accidents became daily tragedies. Tires shredded on gravel, brakes failed on mountain slopes, and engines overheated under unrelenting pressure. Drivers slept sitting up, slumped against their steering wheels at brief stops. A single mistake could turn a truck into a fireball. One spark near a gasoline drum was enough to ignite an inferno. Rain turned dirt tracks into mud rivers. Dust storms blinded entire convoys. At times, the men could barely see the truck ahead, following only by the tremor of its engine in the air. German aircraft still prowled the skies, strafing the roads whenever weather allowed. Yet the Express endured. At its height, more than 6,000 trucks were on the road every day, guarded by thousands of military police and supported by repair units working along the route like emergency surgeons. Engineers patched bridges, salvaged wrecks, and kept the arteries open at any cost. Fuel was everything. Each day, the Red Ball delivered an average of 300,000 gallons of gasoline. Every drop consumed almost as soon as it arrived. Sometimes trucks arrived at the front to find Patton's tanks waiting, engines idling, their crews cheering at the sight of the incoming convoys. For the soldiers at the front, the Red Ball was salvation. For the men driving it, it was survival. There was no glory, no medals or headlines, only the road, the weight of duty, and the endless hum of engines that never stopped. But even miracles have limits. By early September, the Red Ball Express had reached its physical breaking point. The roads were overcrowded, the drivers exhausted, and the depots nearly drained. Despite delivering record tonnage, the demand at the front outpaced supply. Patton's tanks, once unstoppable, began to sputter, not from enemy fire but from empty fuel cans. The entire Allied advance hung in balance, and the question loomed: could logistics keep pace with victory? Behind the dust and noise, the battle for Europe was about to shift, from the front lines to the supply lines themselves. The next days would test whether the Red Ball could hold or collapse under its own success. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express had achieved what no logistics network in history had done, but at a cost no one could ignore. The convoys that once symbolized unstoppable motion were now strained to their mechanical and human limits. Engines roared weaker, tempers flared. The once precise rhythm of the operation began to wobble. The Allies had advanced farther and faster than even Eisenhower had planned. Paris was liberated. Patton's tanks were deep in eastern France, approaching the German border. But the further the front moved, the longer each mile became. Fuel depots that once sat an hour away were now 5 or 6 hours behind, and every added kilometer meant another gallon burned in transport. The numbers stopped adding up. The Red Ball Express was burning nearly as much fuel as it delivered. Trucks guzzled gasoline in the race to carry it forward. Mechanics described it grimly: we were drinking our own blood. Patton's advance began to stutter. At the Moselle River, his spearheads found themselves out of fuel just as German resistance stiffened. Tanks sat idle on country roads, their crews frustrated, waiting for the lifeline that seemed to be unraveling behind them. Commanders grew desperate, siphoning gas from wrecked vehicles, rationing supplies, and even using captured German fuel when possible. For the first time since Normandy, the offensive lost momentum. The roads behind the front were scenes of controlled chaos. Convoys stacked for miles waiting to unload. Drivers slept on their steering wheels, trucks idled empty, and orders changed by the hour. Weather worsened. Cold rain turned the dirt routes into quagmires. Wheels sank deep, trucks skidded, accidents multiplied. In some stretches, the congestion became so severe that engineers had to reroute entire convoys through secondary roads. Maps changed daily. Radio coordination broke down. What had begun as an elegant artery of war now pulsed erratically, clogged by the very success it created. Meanwhile, the enemy began to recover. The German army, battered but unbroken, was reforming behind the Siegfried Line. Their commanders understood what was happening. The Americans' momentum had finally outrun their supplies. For the first time, the laughter that once echoed in German command posts was replaced by cautious hope. They had underestimated American logistics once. Now they waited for it to collapse under its own weight. Inside Allied headquarters, Eisenhower faced his hardest decision yet. Should he keep fueling Patton's rapid advance toward Germany, or divert resources to Montgomery's push toward the Rhine in Operation Market Garden? He could not feed both. Logistics, and not firepower, would decide who struck the next blow. Patton argued fiercely, insisting that one more push would end the war. But the fuel simply wasn't there. His tanks stalled near Metz and Nancy. The Red Ball Express, still moving thousands of tons a day, was no longer enough. In late September, the convoy's tonnage peaked, and then began to fall. Men were collapsing from exhaustion, trucks were breaking faster than they could be repaired, and depots were running dry. It was the natural limit of an extraordinary experiment. Yet even as the express faltered, it never stopped. Drivers kept running until the last drops were spent. When trucks broke down, others towed them. When bridges failed, engineers built new ones overnight. The Red Ball Express had turned from a logistical plan into an act of collective will, a race no one could afford to lose. By October, the great artery began to contract, replaced by newly opened ports like Antwerp and rebuilt French rail lines. The miracle had done its job. It had carried Patton's army across France and brought the Allies to Germany's doorstep. The laughter of the German generals was gone. What replaced it was silent recognition that America had transformed logistics into a weapon as devastating as any tank or bomb. The Red Ball Express had delivered victory to the edge of Europe, but its men and machines were spent. By the first days of October 1944, the sound that had once filled the French countryside, the endless growl of engines, the rattle of wheels on steel bridges, the horns that pierced fog and rain, began to fade. The Red Ball Express, the artery that had pumped lifeblood into the Allied advance, was finally slowing. Ports along the northern coast were now opening. Cherbourg, once crippled by German sabotage, had returned to operation. Antwerp, liberated intact, offered a deep-water harbor capable of receiving vast shipments directly from America. For the first time since D-Day, the supply chain could breathe. Orders went out. The Red Ball Express would be gradually reduced. By November, it would cease to exist in its original form. But its impact was beyond question. In just 82 days, the convoy system had moved over 412,000 tons of supplies across nearly 11 million miles of road. That number, staggering on paper, represented something far more human in reality. It meant tanks that could roll, soldiers who could eat, and artillery that could keep firing. It meant keeping an entire front alive against an enemy that refused to die. In every division log, in every headquarters report, one phrase appeared repeatedly: fuel short but moving. And it was the Red Ball Express that made moving possible. The toll was heavy. Of the thousands of trucks that began the run in August, many were wrecked, burned, or abandoned. Nearly every surviving vehicle bore scars: cracked windshields, dented fenders, tires worn to shreds. Mechanics in rear depots worked without rest, often using spare parts scavenged from destroyed vehicles. For the men, the exhaustion lingered long after the convoys ended. Some were transferred to new supply routes. Others went home, their contribution barely noted in the press. There were no medals for driving, no parades for logistics, yet officers who had seen what they'd done knew the truth. These men had carried an army. General Patton himself, whose armored divisions had depended on those convoys more than any other, later remarked, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." He wasn't exaggerating. The Red Ball Express had been the difference between a victorious pursuit and a stalled front. But in its success, the operation revealed something profound about modern war. Strategy, bravery, and firepower were useless without fuel. For the first time in history, logistics had become as decisive as the battlefield itself. In hindsight, the Red Ball Express marked a turning point in how armies thought about movement and supply. Every major campaign that followed, from Korea to Vietnam to Desert Storm, would carry its lessons. The idea that an army could outpace its logistics would never again be taken lightly. And yet, behind those lessons lay something simpler, the raw endurance of ordinary men, most of them barely trained, many driving trucks held together by luck and wire, who refused to stop until their mission was done. The official order to end the Red Ball Express came on November 16, 1944. Its drivers parked their vehicles for the last time, unaware they had just written a chapter of military history that would never be repeated in scale or spirit. But the war was not over, and their legacy was about to echo in the next phase of the Allied advance, when new supply routes would rise from the ashes of the old. When the Red Ball Express finally rolled to a halt, the Allied war machine stood transformed. What had begun as a desperate improvisation had evolved into a logistical revolution, one that changed how nations fought, supplied, and sustained war. In the months that followed its shutdown, the Red Ball Express was dissected by military analysts and historians alike. Reports poured in from logistics officers detailing lessons learned, the necessity of modular fuel transport, the importance of vehicle maintenance schedules, the coordination of traffic control under combat conditions. For the first time, mobility itself became an operational weapon. Eisenhower's staff concluded that the success of the European campaign had depended not on superior numbers or technology, but on the ability to keep those forces moving. The Red Ball Express had proven that strategy could fail, but supply must never. American engineers took those lessons forward. In the final drive into Germany, new convoy systems were born, this time with improved infrastructure and coordination. What the Red Ball had pioneered in chaos became the blueprint for modern motorized logistics, a system still studied in military academies today. But as the war ended, public attention drifted elsewhere, to the victories, to the heroes of Normandy, to the liberation of Europe. The men who had driven the Red Ball were quietly forgotten. Many of them were African American soldiers who had fought two wars at once, one against the enemy abroad, and one against the prejudice at home. At the time, nearly 75% of Red Ball drivers were black servicemen, drawn from segregated transportation units. They faced discrimination from within their own army, denied equal recognition, housed separately and often dismissed as expendable. Yet when the Army's mobility hung in the balance, it was their hands that gripped the wheels. They endured fatigue, enemy air raids, and the loneliness of endless nights on the road. Many never received official decorations. Some were killed in accidents or ambushes, buried in temporary graves with no record of their service in the historic convoy they helped sustain. Decades later, historians began to restore their names to memory. Monuments were raised in Normandy and Reims to honor the Red Ball Express drivers. Old footage resurfaced, convoys racing through fog, men laughing beside their trucks, mud splashing across faces lit by exhaustion and pride. It was a reminder that history's greatest victories are not only written by generals, but also by those who kept the wheels turning. The Red Ball Express had done more than feed Patton's blitz. It had proven that logistics was not just the backbone of war, it was its heartbeat. From that point on, every major American campaign, from Berlin to Baghdad, would carry the spirit of those 7,000 trucks and their anonymous drivers. Each convoy, each line of supply, each soldier who kept the front alive owed something to that frantic, heroic summer of 1944. The roads of France eventually healed. Grass grew over the old tire tracks. The temporary bridges were dismantled and silence returned to the countryside. But beneath that silence lay history, the echo of engines that had once carried the weight of a world at war. Their mission was simple: keep moving. And they did, until victory itself caught up with them. In the end, the Red Ball Express was more than a convoy. It was a symbol of what happens when necessity forces humanity to its inventive edge. No grand speeches, no medals, no dramatic headlines, just engines, mud, and men who refused to stop. It was logistics turned into courage, discipline turned into endurance. In every roar of a truck climbing a French hill, there was something deeply human, the need to push forward. No matter how heavy the load, war has a way of glorifying destruction, the tanks, the battles, the triumphs, Yet it's the quiet, unseen effort that often decides everything. The Red Ball Express proved that wars are not only won by those who pull the trigger, but by those who keep the trigger armed. Its legacy endures not in monuments or textbooks, but in the modern understanding that movement, supply, connection, logistics, is life itself in warfare. Without it, even the mightiest army stalls. The men of the Red Ball Express didn't fight for glory. They fought against distance, against time, against exhaustion. They fought for the simple, relentless idea that momentum must never die. And though the roads of France have long since grown silent, the echo of their wheels remains, a reminder that history's victories are not only fought but carried.